Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by Drs. Scott Keith and Rod Rosenblatt. The last couple weeks, it's mid to late January now. The last couple weeks, I've been asking for people to go rate the show on iTunes. Thank you for everybody who's gone and done that. We could still use your help. We have a big goal for this year. I'm trying to get up to 1,000 downloads, ratings. 1,000 downloads, that would be kind of funny. No, we're much past 1,000 downloads. We're trying to get 1,000 ratings on iTunes, and it's close to 500 5-star ratings, which is phenomenal. And I thank everybody who's done that. It's really cool to see people rally and help us out. And it's not just so that we can read it and feel good about the show. It really does help search results. It helps other people view the show, because the way that podcast catalogs work is they take those ratings into account when somebody searches for something and how they present that information to people. And so it's a vital way of how you can help us reach more people, grow the show, and keep on going. So again, thank you if you've done that. And if you haven't yet, please do. If you could, just take 5 minutes out of your day to go onto iTunes. You can do it from the internet too. You don't have to have a Mac, and you can go rate podcasts in the Apple Podcasts section. So,
thought you had to have an iPhone.
No, that's they were the pioneer in podcasting, and so they tried to make it available. You could, back in the day before all the cloud services, you could download. I think you still can. You can download Windows to or iTunes to a Windows machine or whatever.
Gotcha.
But you don't have to download it anymore. You can just go to Apple's website, and they have a section for iTunes and podcasts and the like, and you can rate things from there. So, I may include a direct link to our show's directory in iTunes in the show notes. That way, if you're having a hard time finding how you would do that and you don't use Apple Podcasts as your player, I have iPhone, Mac, iPad, whatever, and I don't even use Apple Podcasts. So it's common. So I'll send the link there so that people can have an easier time navigating it. The other thing, as we get going into the year, is that we want to say thank you to everybody who supported the show financially at our year-end request. We had a lot of people come up and support the podcasting and all the efforts at 1517. And so, again, a big thank you for that. And if you've been a long-time listener or a short-time listener who has had, gained a lot of value from listening to the Thinking Fellows and the other resources at 1517, and you've been thinking about donating, I would highly encourage you to set up a small or affordable recurring monthly donation. Those really help throughout the year so that the entirety of our donation efforts aren't just in that last sort of push in December, and we can sort of get a picture of where we're at with people throughout the rest of the year. So again, thank you for your help with that. So for the next 6 to 8 weeks, depends on how many questions we get and how fast we tackle them, I think it would be a good idea to revisit apologetics. This was a big part of year one. It was actually the second series we did on the Thinking Fellows. So we started off with the basics of Christian doctrine following the Loci Communes. And right after that, we moved into, I think it was a 20-something episode series on apologetics. And
those are all available to people still?
Yep, through the Thinking Fellows library. If you're a new listener, you'll have to scroll back through the feed a little bit, but you can go on any podcasting platform, and once you scroll down into year one, you'll start seeing apologetic episodes in there. And then in the last 2 years, we've done sprinkled apologetic episodes here and there, sometimes a couple at a time, or particular apologetic questions, or if we had a guest on whose specialty was apologetics. But we haven't done a long-running section of apologetic episodes in quite some time. And I think, it's been 3 years since we've done those episodes, and so it's probably time to revisit it, since we've revisited so many of the doctrines we did year one. I guarantee there are new listeners who might not even know that we do apologetics as sort of a regular piece or as a core element of the show, except as we've heard it in passing. And so we're just going to reintroduce that. So this first episode in this multi-week series that we're doing, I just want to redefine some terms. I want to set a baseline. I want to, talk about multiple types of apologetic approaches, what we primarily talk about and use, and then go from there. So to start, I opened up this sort of publicly on Twitter and Facebook, and I posted some other places online saying, hey, we're taking apologetic questions, send this in. Within a couple hours, I got a lot of responses. And one of the trends I noticed, and I don't want to call anybody out because this isn't particularly bad, but I do think I want to center us here, is that a lot of people were saying, oh, great, could you do an apologetic for Lutheranism? Or could you guys cover the best apologetic for the Lord's Supper? And X, Y, and Z. And without being rude, that's not Christian apologetics as a categorical thing. Those things might be an apologetic as in an argument for a doctrine, but really that's doctrinal theology.
Yep.
And we've done that in many places on many different episodes. If you want to hear what we think a good presentation of the Lord's Supper is, you can hear that on the episode episode or two that we've done specifically on the Lord's Supper, and probably the 15 Q&A episodes we've done where we've answered questions and objections to that. Same with baptism, things like that. I think as far as apologetics of like Lutheranism, the show tends to be a presentation of Lutheran doctrine. And so if you're looking for a good presentation of Lutheran doctrine to give to a non-Lutheran, I think there is plenty of that abounding. And so this, when we're talking about apologetics, we're talking about a specific thing, and that is the presentation of the gospel to outsiders. And when that is pushed back against, or there's a critique, or maybe even outrightly attacked, having a response to that. And so, do you guys agree? Is that what we're doing here? Is there any distinction I'm missing?
No, I think the confusion is warranted in some sense, because I've seen it, especially in Lutheran circles, I've seen it quite a bit lately where somebody will say they're doing a show on apologetics or write a blog on apologetics, or even, do an event that's named an apologetic event. And many of the topics within this event will be defending a particular doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that's, using the word correctly, you can say, okay, I'm going to give an apologetic for the Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper. All that would mean is you're going to give a defense of the Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper. That's not an incorrect thing to say. But it's sort of just taking the normal use of the word Christian apologetics and then applying it to any doctrine within Christianity or within your specific system. Typically, apologetics falls under the branch of studying theology that's called systematic theology.
Correct.
Within that sort of branch of study, of theological study, you can sort of, again, break that down into three other parts. Polemics, which is mostly what they're talking about, where you're in that branch, you would say, the doctrine of baptism is this, ... The doctrine of grace is this, ... Drawn from the scriptures, of course, especially within Lutheranism, drawn from the scriptures. Then you have another branch of theology or systematics is called symbolics, and that's basically the study and or writing of various confessions of faith. I teach a Lutheran confessions class at the university for the master's students. That's technically a symbolics class.
Mm-hmm. You start with the early Christian symbols. You start with the earliest of creeds.
Right. Then the last sort of branch in there is apologetics, which is a branch of evangelism, right? The sharing of the faith. And it's the defense of the Christian faith to unbelief. Not to another system within Christianity. Now, the confusion on this these days, to sort of mix words up again, because especially on social media, I don't think personally we live in a very polemical age, but on social media, we certainly do. In other words, face to face, we have a hard time telling anyone that we disagree with them about anything, even our family sometimes. But if some stranger 3,000 miles away on Twitter, we have no problem not only telling them that we disagree with them, but that they're probably going to hell because of our disagreement.
Yeah.
And so, it's not too surprising to me that these get conflated a little bit in the way we sort of speak of things right now, just because social media has brought out these sort of micro arguments. I guess I'd call them micro arguments that really blow up into macro arguments. I'm not really on social media in that way where I'm actually seeing some of these things, but I get people send me screenshots, a lot of these, where somebody will have a theological disagreement, right? And just to use their words, one person is giving an apologetic for an X view of, say, I don't know, the Lord's Supper, right? And another person is giving an apologetic for a Y view of the Lord's Supper. And then all of a sudden, one person will tell another one that they're a heretic.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
You know, which means literally that they're not a Christian.
Yep.
So I can see how they believe that this is apologetics proper.
Yeah.
Because so many things these days seem to rise to the level of heresy when they're just, I mean, technically they're not, but in the argument they rise to that level. And to be clear, in order for a theological disagreement to rise to the level of heresy, or a theological position to rise to the level of heresy, it has to deny one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity.
We used to use it as saying, is it at least in agreement with the creeds?
Yeah, and I think you can do that pretty easily, because most heresies, most recorded heresies, are some error regarding the teaching of either Christ in his divinity or in his humanity, or the Trinity generally.
Yeah, then the nature of God and how that relates to Christ are essentially where all of that falls apart.
If I believe in the real presence and you believe in transubstantiation, you're not a heretic.
Yep.
Right? If I believe in the real presence and Rod is defending a spiritual presence, he's not a heretic. We would say the word for it that everyone's looking for out there instead of heretic.
By the way, that's all theoretical for people.
Yeah, but the word everyone's looking for is heterodox.
Yeah.
Right? They believe differently than you do on this point. Now, if you believe you hold sort of the high ground on that, believing differently means they're wrong. Right? But that does not still make them a heretic.
Yep.
So it's not apologetics.
That
was a long way to get to that.
On the White Horse Inn, I didn't have to see Orthodox Calvinists as heretics.
Correct.
Saw them as confused.
And wrong on some things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But right on others.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the ways I was trying to address this in some of the personal messages I was sending to people is that doesn't mean that your question about, say, a defense of the Lord's Supper or even Lutheranism is a bad question.
Yep.
That's not what we're doing in these series. In fact, those are in many circumstances good and right questions that we have asked and have addressed, and that I'm happy to do in the future in different contexts. But for this particular series and exercise, what we're trying to do is go back to this, formal Christian apologetic to the outsider, defending the Christian faith and presenting the Christian faith. I think one of the other areas of confusion, maybe not confusion, but possibly too, is that sometimes when you're doing apologetics, it's educating Christians in those defenses as well. It's not always making an argument to the outsider. A lot of what you guys do.
Yeah, we've said that before. Especially, I think Adam and I did a whole show on this. Is where Adam more so than myself, but I'd say for the last 6 or 7 years, this applies to me as well. We've been asked several times a year to come out to a congregation and teach that congregation how to do apologetics. And we'll say, like, why are you going to Michigan? Oh, I'm doing an apologetics thing. But technically, I'm probably not doing apologetics, right? Because everyone in the audience will likely be a Christian, and so which is funny because at every time I've ever done that, there's always been one that's not, and so sometimes at least one that's not. But still, technically, you're going out there because an evangelism board or whatever has realized that if they actually share the gospel, eventually they will get some questions, and they don't know what to say to those questions. 9 times out of 10, it'll be that the 5 people on the planning committee have children that are either in the process of leaving the faith or have left the faith, and they'd like to know what to say to them.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that a lot. I think sometimes people's minds are drawn specifically to a type of like on-the-street evangelism that is commendable, but I think a lot of the modern necessity comes from sometimes this coming in your own front door, not even intentionally, but like you said, a lot of people have children or grandchildren or stuff like that who've gone through a course of
everybody does.
Yeah, everybody does. And they come home, and these conversations inevitably come up if this matters to you, or if they don't come up. I also know a lot of people who are afraid of having those conversations, and it sort of eats at them.
Well, I'd say even if you're a parent, and even if your children have stayed in the faith, one day they'll probably get married, and that makes no guarantee about the people that then marry into your family, and or what the state of your grandchildren will be some 20 some odd years down the road from that. This is to some degree, this is stuff that everybody should know at least a little bit of. And I'll kind of lean on what Rod and Dr. Montgomery always taught us. You should at least know where to put your hand on a bookshelf, to hand to somebody, because you're and anytime we do this, I think it's good to give the disclaimer that we're not saying that just by listening to these series or having us come to your church and teach that you have to memorize all this stuff.
Right. A lot of real apologetics to the non-Christian is giving him good stuff to read and never giving him a religious drivel.
Well, yeah, and I always rely on Dr. Montgomery's sort of, first couple points, which is, take their questions seriously, but don't take their questions too seriously. In other words, understand for that person this could be or is probably a real question, but never really think that there's probably not a good answer to the question, right? And if Christians come into these conversations sort of knowing, having, even if they haven't memorized it, having heard a possible answer to an objection, when they get that objection in real life, they'll know that there is an answer to it. Even if they don't remember the answer, maybe they can remember where the book is that has it, or the podcast, or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's
exactly right.
That's great. So, again, to set some groundwork, it'd be good since you sort of said it belongs to this area of theology called systematics, could we lay out the different types of apologetics that there are, the different categories? I think people are familiar with apologetics sort of on popular levels as they happen with conversations, say, specifically with science or age of the earth type stuff. But what other categories, or where does this fall?
Some good news first. The same questions recur in real human conversations over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And there are only about a half a dozen of them. Yeah. They just recur.
I'll say that the internet and social media makes some of those instances hilarious, because you'll get this sort of this newfound atheist who's been empowered, who has one of these things that's been answered probably 10,000 times.
Oh, we had that in the house over Christmas with your sister's boyfriend.
And you'll get something like, what about the fossil record? Ha, I got you. And I'm like, oh, nobody's ever thought about the fossil record. No Christian once.
Or extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
Like, you came up with that one yourself, did you?
Yeah.
I never heard that before.
Yeah. So there's good news in this, that if you get to where you can comfortably field on your own or by use of material you can give away, there are only about 6 to 9 of these questions, or a dozen at the most.
Yeah, I usually say a dozen. You could go to Vegas and bet everything on the same 6. Right. So there's maybe, if you extrapolate it out, there's maybe a dozen.
Yep.
But there's always the same 6 or so.
Yep.
I mean, always.
Yep. So to be able to be comfortable with those is really enough for the lay Christian who's on the street and in the office.
And they have variants, but that doesn't mean that it's essentially the same question.
Yep.
No, and that does bring up an episode that we'll do in the future here. It'll either be the next one or the one after that. I have I have questions from listeners, but I also found some threads online of atheists making arguments. And the ones I tried to grab there were ones related to common ones, but were sort of a new spin on it, where even I was like, oh, I've never heard somebody say that one before. So we'll do some of that too. And I think part of that episode is I tried to pick some of these unique ones because I think we'll be able to show how they really do turn back into ones that you've heard before. When you get to the root of the issue, it's sort of surface level that these take on a new flavor. So
Fair enough.
So with that, if there's 6 questions, is there a
another
certain
thing you
nature?
asked about different types of.
Yeah.
Let's talk about at least the 2 major types.
Yeah.
Evidential apologetics operates parallel with science and in interaction with it, where you see truth matters in the real world, not mathematics, as matters of evidence in the same way you'd see evidence used in a court of law. It's a sliding scale, analog, not binary, and if the evidence is good enough, a rational person will follow it wherever it's leading. The competitor in Christian circles, at least for the last 50 years, has been what's called presuppositionalism. We've got representatives of it in our own Lutheran greats, but the great name associated with it was Cornelius Van Til of Westminster Seminary, Philadelphia. And presuppositionalism says start by assuming all of the Bible is true. Then compare your version with that and see which of the 2 is more consistent. You're looking for inconsistencies. It's a Herculean attempt, but ill-founded, at least if you ask evidentialists like me, because the first move is the impossible one. Let's start, both of us, by assuming that all of the Bible is true.
Yeah. It has a particular philosophical flavor and necessity that evidentialism doesn't, because it asks you to do a lot of thought experiments while you're doing it. And one of the core sort of arguments here is that the worldview which you actually live in and you may not realize is only coherent in a Christian system. That's one of its sort of things. So you have to sort of argue somebody philosophically into that, which, like you said, means finding inconsistencies in other worldviews, poking a lot of holes in things, and then trying to fill those holes with things from the Bible.
Yep.
But you have to start off with, hey, just follow with me.
If somebody had done that when I was agnostic in college, I would have said, wait a minute, I can't make that first move, even as hypothetical.
You might not have said it so politely either. I mean, that's the basic problem. There's a couple of basic problems with it. I think epistemologically, if I understand it right, Rod, and correct me if I'm wrong, presuppositionalism basically believes that the non-Christian can't understand anything from the text of Scripture until they believe it in the first place.
They can't even do engineering unless they're parasitic on Christian.
Gotcha. So that makes it difficult for the person who, is even trying to present sort of historical evidence for the resurrection.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
if you believe that they just can't get it until they come, it's basic. It's like long form preaching with some worldview destruction mixed in.
I'll give you a quote from Van Til. Dr. Montgomery believes in praise to a probable God.
Yeah.
No, I think that's probably shocking to a lot of people.
That's probably shocking to a lot of Lutherans.
And I think one of the other things is that one of the biggest.
Did Van Til say that of Montgomery?
Who's that?
Did Van Til say that of Montgomery? Or are you extrapolating?
No, I think he actually did after Dr. Montgomery published Once Upon an A Priori.
That is amazing. That's just, I really like that. Sorry.
Well,
another one
it maybe requires some context for our listeners, but I
think it probably does.
I really
too.
enjoy it.
Yeah. Another one that is attributable rightly to Dr. Van Til was, to the jaundiced eye, everything appears yellow.
That's right. That's what I was thinking of.
Yes. Yeah. And
so even sort of what an evidentialist would say is sort of clear evidence that you can understand, without having to come to full faith. the presuppositionalists would say, no, you can't, because to the jaundiced eye, everything's yellow.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of the other things one of the critiques I've heard from a presuppositionalist point of view against evidentialism is that it's sort of it was actually said this way, it's sort of a wicked thing for Christians to do because they have to assume that they're not right to engage in it, and they have to indulge non-Christians in a sinful worldview. And I think the funny thing about that to me is that that's sort of in the evangelical task exactly what you're called to do, is go preach something to a sinful world. Is you have to sort of engage with the sinful world. You're not totally removed from it and sort of yelling from outside of it.
I'll tell you the thing that bugs me about it is, to my way of thinking, there's just way too much worldview discussion in there.
Yep.
We've done a show, and it was a long time ago, but on the difference between faith and epistemology.
Yep.
And we're not setting them against each other, right? But just saying that on one point, somebody can know something, and even that knowledge of something doesn't equal saving faith, because saving faith is something
Built on it.
But not exactly the same as it.
Yep.
And which is why we will say, even the demons knew that Christ was Lord, but this knowledge didn't save them.
Mm-hmm.
And epistemologically, for human beings, I mean, basically, this works the same, right? Christian, non-Christian, the way we come to knowledge about a certain event, the way we discern whether that thing is true or false, that statement is true or false. We do this sort of the same across all lines.
Mm-hmm.
Believer, not believer, countries.
Irrelevant,
right? I think Dr. Montgomery starts out the Tractatus by saying something akin to that. That if there is a sort of universal, it's not logic, and this is how sort of we determine things. Your worldview now may color the way you sort of interpret some of that information, right?
Correct.
Or whether or not you believe that even information can be gathered or whatever, but you can just be epistemologically wrong on that, right? You can just be discernibly wrong on that.
When worldviews are seemingly infinite, too, there's not one school, there's sort of broader ones like Eastern and Western worldviews or whatever, but especially in sort of our pluralistic society, it's nearly infinite, especially when it comes to epistemological grounds of the way people believe they get information.
This isn't technically a worldview claim, because this isn't determining whether you're a conservative or a progressive. This is analyzing the claims of Christ, right? That he said he was God.
Yep.
And it's also sort of saying,
did he back that up?
Yeah.
How did he back that up? Did the ways that he backed that up sort of rise evidentially to the level where
Compelling.
it's compelling?
Yep.
And if it is, then what do you do with that information? That's different than, do I think it's ethical or not ethical to pay for homeless people to get hotel rooms? Which will be, my answer to that will be more determined by my quote unquote worldview than was Christ Lord?
Yep.
Which is not a worldview question.
Well, also,
Good
as
for
well,
you.
two Christians could answer that question differently.
Right.
Those ethical questions differently, and we could debate about who was right or wrong on those things.
Right.
But, I mean, you're actually sort of bringing in a point of weakness when somebody opens their eyes and sees how many different points of views Christians really do have on worldview issues.
Well, yeah, this isn't worldview. This is Jesus Christ Lord and Savior or not? It's a question. A question that has a clear answer in the text and that the evidence points to.
And I think evidentialism just goes straight to the objections hard and fast. So especially things like miracle or who Christ was, instead of
it goes directly to Christ and his claims. And from that, all those others arise, all of them legitimate.
Yeah, and I think, for Lutherans for a second here too, there's something about evidentialism that is particularly compatible with the way we do theology already, which is that its number one thing that it clings to, and the thing that it tries to drive people to is the foot of the cross.
Yep.
And to go examine and look at and hear the testimony of the cross.
Yeah,
I always
God-
say add to that when we're on our game, just so in case
Yeah.
people have run into Lutherans who aren't on their game on that one. Sorry.
But
Yeah, or I've thought of it this way. I've heard people say it this way, and they're correct. There are 100 questions or assertions regarding God that don't touch the incarnate God.
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, endless.
Yep.
Most preaching.
And this is the evidential apologetic is when aimed at Christ and his cross is likewise like the proclamation of the gospel for comfort. It's a teaching on the resurrection. It's trying to get people to the promise
Yep.
of God.
Yep.
It's actually not detached from the practice of proclaiming Christ crucified
That's
for the
right.
forgiveness of sins. It's in part with that.
Yep.
And there are too many apologetics and methods which are can be wholly detached from Christ and the forgiveness of sins and the death and resurrection of Christ. And those are ones that I see as being the most popular, that I see happening all the time.
What would you imagine if you asked the American populace in the most general of ways, and you have to hope that they understand the question, does theism save? What do you think the results would be? Belief in God.
Oh, I bet most Americans would say yes, with the caveat that it also has some sort of goodness of lived life.
Yep.
But yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think I would ask what God.
Yeah, sure.
You want to can you narrow that down for me a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, and like I said, because that comes with a moral code. Which moral code shall I follow?
Yeah.
Sure, and why?
Yeah.
It,
Messy.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, again, I think this is part of the appeal here part of the appeal I want to make is to Lutheran. We have a large Lutheran audience, and
we don't teach here at seminary, so the pastors were never taught.
Yeah, there's not people are, if they're familiar with evidential apologetics and Lutheranism, I'll say most of the people I've met, it's because they have some connection to Concordia Irvine, and you were doing it there for a long time. Other people have read more broadly for one reason or another. They either had people encourage them to, or whatnot, or heard Montgomery on radio shows and things like that. But yeah, I think as I hope to present it, this really is like the apologetic method that Lutherans should cling to, because it goes hand in hand with our preaching, it goes hand in hand with our doctrine, it goes hand in hand with the law and the gospel, with Christ's death and resurrection, and I love keeping apologetics centered on that aim, on the aim of the rest of our theology, which is the forgiveness of sins and the consolation of grieved consciences, which is something that a lot of these people who are looking for apologetic knowledge, as we talked about, who, there's a lot of people when you talk to them who have guilt about their children or grandchildren or whoever's coming to them not being in their faith. There's a lot of guilt about this. And so even more so, this needs to be attached to the foot of the cross so that we not only bring people not just to some ethereal God in Christ, but we can also, at the same time, preach forgiveness to those who feel guilt for and somehow failing at this task.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, let's see. What can we do to sum up the last 5 minutes of episode 1? Because I don't want to start one of the big questions before we do that.
Well, I think in one way or another, we've attempted to tackle our alternatives in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Major alternatives. You don't have to do a seminar on unbelief. It wouldn't take very long to do it, and you'd satisfy the unbeliever. Yeah, that's fair to me.
Yeah. I think I'd say that as we go through the series, you'll probably hear us say many times that unbelievers have some good questions, right? And that's kind of shocking to a lot of people, because a lot of what we get in church is just sort of hold on to this, never doubt, all this stuff. And you might hear us say, I understand that person's doubt on this.
Yes.
I've struggled with that myself, or something like that.
Yep.
And I only say that so that our listeners know that if they are struggling with anything that we talk about, that struggle is just part of being who you are, right? And know that there are some good resources here. There are some good, at least possible answers to these questions. But don't let your struggle sort of lead you further down doubt. Sort of engage it and find the answers.
It makes me think of the outstanding pastor scholars. And the first name that comes to mind for me is Tim Keller.
Yeah.
Doing what he does in Manhattan so that people from Wall Street are brown bagging it, sitting there eating their lunch while he's doing some sermon that covers an apologetic theme. Keller has done that well. And I think that should be a clue to us Lutherans.
Yeah.
There it is, executed very, very well. We might not give the same Christian answers he gives,
Sure.
but he's doing it in a very, very foreign field, New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, the center of daily life in a major metropolis is not Christ.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything there is foreign to it.
Yep.
So I think that as well. As we go into this, I guess I could say that we're going to try to outline some apologetic, like I said, the direct apologetic questions that listeners asked. I think in next episode, probably we'll outline more of the historical, evidential apologetic, what exactly we mean by saying that it clings to the death and resurrection of Christ, and sort of what those arguments look like. And then for the next 6 weeks, too, we will also have a interview with a recent author at 1517, David Anderson, who published the most recent apologetic work, and we'll have the links to that book in those episodes. We're going to do an interview, and we're going to cover the subject of his book as well. And I'm
Faithless to Fearless: The Events That Changed. Sorry, I forget. I always forget this.
Subtitles.
The Event That Changed the World.
Yeah, which is I think a great addition to sort of the evidentiary apologetic library.
Yeah,
it's great. So, and again, I think in 2 weeks from this episode, we will have him on to talk about the book. And I did say I sent this question out to people online, but if you have specific apologetic questions, I would say from the time you're listening to this episode, you probably have about 5 days to email them in. You can go to 1517.org. There's a contact form there, and you can email them in. You can also go to the Thinking Fellows page on Twitter at Thinking Fellows. You can send direct messages there. They're open. You can go to the Thinking Fellows page on Facebook as well. You can send direct messages there, however you find it easiest to communicate with us. I'm going to be combing through those questions the next couple of weeks to add things to the list. And like I said, if you think we've missed anything, you can always comment as well. Hey, thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you for rating and subscribing to the show. Thank you for donating and supporting us through this year. We'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.